Quiara is a neighbor. She's the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright of Water by the Spoonful and the author of a memoir, My Broken Language. She wrote the book for the Tony-winning Broadway musical In the Heights and later adapted it for the screen. Her notable essays include High Tide of Heartbreak in American Theatres Magazine and Corey Couldn't Take It Anymore in The Cut. As a prison reform activist, Hudes and her cousin founded Emancipated Stories, a platform where people behind bars can share one page of their life story with the world. She lives with her family in Washington Heights, but frequently returns to her native Philly. Welcome, Quiara.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Hello. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm really grateful to Word Up and the community of book supporters and authors and book lovers in this neighborhood. So tonight, I think of as a 30th birthday party for this book. I should have brought cake, I'm realizing now, and like a 3 and a 0 candle. And we'll get into what this book means. And not just this book, it's the whole trilogy that's been re-released of the memoirs with new forewords, which are beautiful. But we'll get into that. Let me first just talk a little bit about what we're gonna do and who we're gonna do it with. So I was asked to come moderate. It's really my honor to reflect on how, when I was Puerto Rican, created a path certainly for myself, but I think as evidenced here today, Jaquira Diaz wrote one of the introductions for the new When I Was Puerto Rican. The field of Puerto Rican memoirs is rich and full now, and we know who we have to thank for that. So we're here to say thank you. We're here to celebrate the book. So I have asked them to read certain passages that spoke to me for tonight. I have some questions prepared about what this book has meant for us. We asked community members to contribute questions that I have ready to ask at the go. And I would like to end, I do a lot of these book events and they can feel very talky. And I like to do some sort of ceremonial component each time, just to honor the people actually in the room. So I'd like to end with a little ceremony honoring the book. All right, first, Luis Miranda was born in Vega Alta, Puerto Rico, and came to New York as a young adult for graduate school in psychology. His tireless career of political advocacy, governmental leadership, and community mobilization includes serving under 3 New York mayors, founding and being the inaugural president of the Hispanic Federation, creating Amber Charter School in East Harlem, and supporting the election campaigns of Letitia James, Hillary Clinton, Charles Schumer, and Fernando Ferrer. As board chair of the Latino Victory Fund, Luis mobilizes resources to support Latino candidates running in local and state elections nationwide. He is also an avid advocate for the arts, including chairing the board of the Public Theater. Esmeralda Santiago was born in Macun, a rural neighborhood in Puerto Rico, and moved to New York at the age of 13. Her memoirs and novels are beloved to readers around the world. Most recently, the novel Las Madres, which my own cousin Cuca called me up and said, "This is the best book I've ever read," in tears. Esmeralda's groundbreaking 1993 memoir, When I Was Puerto Rican, has become a rite of passage for Boricua and diaspora readers like myself. Esmeralda's first published poem, Mi Sangre, is featured in the recent anthology, Daughters of Latin America, and in 8 brief stanzas, it packs the punch of an entire book. So check out that anthology too, and her poem in there. She is, in my opinion, a founding mother of Boricua letters, and also seems to be reverse aging. So I think there are many more books to come. And before I bring them out, just a brief word on my personal connection to the two of them, because I do know them both personally. I was at the Cuatro Festival in Chicago. They used to do a Cuatro Festival every year. I don't know if they still do that. And an elderly trovador came out and said, you know what? He was so frail. He could hardly hold his cuatro. And he said, what is the essence of being Puerto Rican? So I leaned in. He answered his own question and he said, simply being happy to be alive. And his spirit held that truth. It was beautiful. And ever since I've asked myself that question, and my personal experience, what is the essence of being Puerto Rican, in my case, diaspora, is sharing. Pull up a seat at my table and I'll share what I have. In Esmeralda's case, she shared encouragement and support as I released my memoir. And in Luis's case, he shared resources that helped my family during a time of profound crisis. So I'd like to invite them both up here. Thank you so much. Welcome. So I'm going to try to be mindful of time, but I also know there's a lot of ground to cover. So I thought, just for my own greedy sake, would they indulge me with reading from the books? Esmeralda, why don't we start with you? And maybe I'll hold the microphone. Wait, do we have a stand? Okay. I just chose passages that I loved.
De lado. Ponlo de lado. Okay. All right. You want me to introduce what I'm reading?
The only thing I'll say is that she's entering high school at this moment. So that's the age we're at.
Yes. So I'm auditioning for Performing Arts High School after a kind of harrowing few weeks where I was being trained how to be an actress when I actually could hardly speak English. So here I am. I know. Here I am in front of the people who are going to determine the rest of my life. I had dreamed of this moment for several weeks. More than anything, I wanted to impress the panel with my talent so that I would be accepted into performing arts and leave Brooklyn every day. And I hoped one day I would never go back. But the moment I faced these three impeccably groomed women, I forgot my English and Mrs. Johnson's lessons on how to behave like a lady. In the agony of trying to answer their barely comprehensible questions, I jabbed my hands here and there, forming words with my fingers because the words refused to leave my mouth. Why don't you let us hear your monologue now? The woman with the dangling glasses asked softly. I stood up abruptly, and my chair clattered onto its side 2 feet from where I stood. I picked it up, wishing with all my strength that a thunderbolt would strike me dead to ashes on the spot. It's all right, she said. Take a breath. We know you're nervous. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, walked to the middle of the room, and began my monologue. You belong to a type that's very common in this country, Mrs. Phelps, a type of self-centered, petty, and more some boring the grass with men and shun and ball, proclivities on the side. In spite of Mr. Gaddy's reminders that I should speak slowly and enunciate every word, even if I didn't understand it, which I didn't, I recited my 3-minute monologue in 1 minute flat. The small woman's long lashes seemed to have grown with amazement. The elegant woman's serene face twitched with controlled laughter. The tall one, dressed in beige, smiled sweetly. Thank you, dear, she said. Could you wait outside for a few moments? I resisted the urge to curtsy. The long hallway had narrow wainscoting halfway up to the high ceiling. Single bulb lamps hung from long cords, creating yellow puddles of light on the polished brown linoleum tile. A couple of girls my age sat on straight chairs next to their mothers, waiting their turn. They looked up as I came out, and the door shut behind me. Mommy stood up from her chair at the end of the hall. She looked as scared as I felt. What happened? Nothing, I mumbled, afraid that if I began telling her about it, I would break into tears in front of the other people, whose eyes followed me and Mommy as we walked out to the exit sign. I have to wait here a minute. Did they say anything? No, I'm just supposed to wait. We leaned against the wall. Across from us, there was a bulletin board with newspaper clippings about former students. On the ragged edge, a neat person had printed in blue ink, P.A., and the year the actor, dancer, or musician had graduated. I closed my eyes and tried to picture myself on that bulletin board with P.A. 66 across the top. The door at the end of the hall opened, and the woman in beige poked her head out. Esmeralda? See, I mean here, I said, and raised my hand. She led me into the room. There was another girl in there whom she introduced as Bonnie, a junior at the school. Do you know what a pantomime is? The woman asked. I nodded. You and Bonnie are sisters decorating a Christmas tree. Bonnie looked a lot like Juanita Marin, whom I had last seen in Macun 4 years earlier. We decided where the invisible Christmas tree would be, and we sat on the floor and pretended we were taking decorations out of boxes and hanging them on the branches. My family had never had a Christmas tree, but I remembered how once I had helped Papi wind colored lights around the eggplant bush that divided our land from Doña Ana's. We started at the bottom and wound the wire with tiny red bulbs around and around until we ran out. Then Papi plugged another cord to it, and we kept going around until the branches hung heavy with light and the bush looked like it was on fire. Before long, I had forgotten where I was and that the tree didn't exist and Bonnie was not my sister. She pretended to hand me a very delicate ball, and just before I took it, she made it fell to the ground and shattered. I was petrified that Mommy would come in and yell at us for breaking her favorite decoration. Just as I began to pick up the tiny fragments of non-existent crystal, a voice broke in. Thank you. Bonnie got up, smiled, and went out. The elegant woman stretched her hand out for me to shake. We will notify your school in a few weeks. It was very nice to meet you. I shook hands all around, then backed out of the room in a fog, silent, as if the pantomime had taken my voice and the urge to speak. On the way home, Mommy kept asking what had happened, and I kept mumbling, nothing. Nothing happened. Ashamed that after all the hours of practice with Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Barone, and Mr. Gaddy, after the expense of new clothes and shoes, after Mommy had to take a day off from work to take me into Manhattan, after all that, I had failed the audition and would never, ever get out of Brooklyn.
Thank you. How many people here have read When I Was Puerto Rican? Okay, so no spoilers, but we know what happened.
I'm here.
Luis, will you read this passage from us? The reason I chose this passage is because I came of age in Philadelphia in the Hispanic community then, as it was known. And my elders were working hard to build resources all around me. And so this section hit home for me. So just there until it says stop.
There will be an Asian American Federation, an Associated Black Charities, and a Hispanic Federation. The goal was to help the nonprofit sector across the different communities. The federations will raise money for their members and provide technical services to make individual agencies stronger so they could serve New Yorkers in need. I love the challenge, and especially the fact that these organizations didn't already exist. I could create something entirely new to help all the Latino organizations and leaders that had already been working with for more than a decade. I applied for the job and was hired, becoming the founding executive director of the Hispanic Federation. I was given $300,000 and an 8-page concept paper that I quickly decided was insufficient. So I went to the people I knew who could help create a Latino nonprofit network, the local Ecuadorian and Colombian organizations, the Puerto Rican Family Institute, Aspira, and many other organizations that needed to help to create this new federation. I had known from the very beginning of my journey in New York and from my time at Aspira that nonprofits were central to the life of a community. Aspira was committed to developing Puerto Rican leadership. The Hispanic Federation grew out of the concept that our community needed sustainability. It needed the help that the nonprofit sector was delivering. At that point, the sector was a small group of institutions that Puerto Ricans had created as it moved forward as a community. But when the United Way approached me, the Latino community was already more varied than just Puerto Ricans. I knew that we needed to add to our community, but the institutions were not there. We needed to help create them. I believed we needed to develop more organizations for more communities to deliver for our people and to deliver power. We needed to create leadership. There were very few non-Puerto Rican institutions. There were some smaller groups out there, like the Centro Cívico Colombiano and Alianza Dominicana. But we needed to grow, and we needed to be larger than the sum of our parts. I didn't know if I wanted to be considered Hispanic. I don't even know what the word means. But if gringos in their black and white binary construction wanted to understand the world by creating this concept of Hispanic and grouping a whole bunch of people under the same umbrella, then let's go. Instead of being small communities of 1 million each, let's be 3 million or 30 million. We were even asking for it. The powers had lumped Asians together, even though they don't even all speak the same language or have the same culture. This was because of white people's need to understand the world in a simple way. So we were going to do them a favor. We were now going to speak as 30 million people. It was a game changer. We will use their concept to sit at the table with much more power.
Thank you. Esmeralda, how old were you when you wrote When I Was Puerto Rican?
Oh, thank you. I went to performing arts high school. I mean, spoiler. But so I don't need a microphone. I began writing when I was Puerto Rican when I was 40, and it was published when I was 42, 43. I did not know really when I started writing that book that anyone but my family would read it, because I had not found a lot of writing about people like us, Brooklyn, single mother, 11 children, alcoholic grandmother, the whole, business. So it was shocking to me that actually more than my family read it.
And I'm just curious, looking back on that same part of your life, essentially your childhood, that first memoir addresses, who was Esmeralda when she wrote that memoir, and who is Esmeralda now? Has your view and your perspective on your childhood changed over time?
Wow, what a question. I think because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know, I read a lot, but I read fiction. I read a lot of history. So I was not familiar with memoirs. And so I felt that I had to read everything that was memoir-like just so that I could learn. And at the time I was just kind of nervous. Really, I was nervous about giving a lot of information about my family that my family did not allow outside the doors of our apartment. And so there were a lot of things that I talk about in that book that were para la familia, you know? And so I was a little bit more, a little bit more nervous about what my family would think and what than what anybody else would say about the writing. Right now, no me importa. I feel very open to write anything that I want to write without having, people telling me I couldn't, because I did something that was really hard that I didn't know that I could do it, and I did it. And so after that, it gave me enough confidence to continue to look for opportunities to write about nuestra gente, because that was who I cared about. I am married to somebody who's Russian Jew, and I care about him and his family, but I care more about nuestra gente, or as I prefer call it, mi gente. And so it has changed in that sense that I'm not afraid anymore. I fight for the opportunity and the right to say what I want to say. And if you don't want to read it, you don't have to. And so I had to come to that, because the other thing about being a writer is you want to be read. Of course, you want people to read your work and to understand it and to discuss it and to connect to your story. As you know, as a memoir writer, this is a big part of it for us, that we don't feel as alone in these journeys as we did before we learned something about other people who had gone through something like it. So I think as an old woman now, I'm older than you both and many of the people in this room, I have kind of settled into this place where I can do anything that I want to do, and I will do it as long as I can.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Toni Morrison, it makes me think of something Toni Morrison said in her Nobel speech, I believe it was, about a woman who lives outside of the village, and amongst her people, she is considered both the law and its transgression. And I feel that in what you're saying to us, to me. Luis, when did you encounter When I Was Puerto Rican? What was the experience of reading it? What was that like for you?
I was probably your age. I purchased it immediately. Just remember, this is 30 years ago when nobody spoke in the written language about Puerto Ricans. So I remember reading it, and I learned about it not because of any publicity, but because your cousin, Esmeralda Santiago, your aunt, Esmeralda Santiago, had the same name, said to me, oh yeah, no, that's my niece. And Esmeralda Santiago was the person to convince me to stay in New York, get married, and start a family. So there was that connection to the name, and then reading it, it was clear that it was speaking to me as a member of a community that was important. You know, I have done plenty of research when I was at the Hispanic Federation, and what we learned over and over, it's when we asked a Latino then, who are you? Nobody said, I'm Hispanic. That was the term that was used then, not Latino or Latinx or any other term. People will talk about their country of origin. So for me, to encounter someone who had written about what's in the mind of every Latino who comes into this country, which is, where am I coming from?
Thank you. Esmeralda, over the last 30 years, you hear from fans, you hear from readers. What is a common thing that you hear? What's a frequently mentioned passage or something, you know, a common thread amongst your readers?
It's really interesting for me that the thing that I hear the most and the most moving for me emotionally is that they say, you're writing my life. People come to me and this either they got closer to their mother or their grandma or their dad or a family member from a different generation because they learned something about their lives that they had not asked or that relative had not talked about. So for me, that's the most frequent question, or it's not a question, it's a statement where people will say, I really feel like you wrote my story. And for me, the reason it's so emotional for me is that I felt so alone in this journey, arriving in the United States at 13, learning English, taking my mother to welfare office and emergency rooms with kids, trying to translate for her when I barely spoke the language myself. All these kinds of things that I felt completely alone in this process. In addition to, I was a very curious, bien presentada little girl with lots of questions that my mom could not answer. She could not help me in what was going on. So when I hear somebody tell me that it's been, you know, that it's meant something to them personally, they don't know me until they show up. I really feel like, oh my God, we were not alone. You know, I mean, I didn't know it then, but now I know it now, that we are not alone. We have literature to help us, to guide us through some of these lagunas that we have to ford. And it's always touching when somebody says that to me.
Thank you. I'm curious about, this is just me. It's like, what can I ask them if I have a chance? I'm curious about your relationship to libraries in Puerto Rico and in your arrival here. Was there a local library in Macun? Was there one that you discovered here? What was that experience? And I'm going to ask you that question too, Luis.
The first kind of public library that I encountered in Puerto Rico was the same year that we left Puerto Rico. There was a little library in the little middle school where I was a student, and I did not know these places existed. You know, I was a real good reader, but I read. My dad would bring the Reader's Digest in español and the newspapers and things like that. So the idea that there was a place where not only were there books from like all over, but that I could borrow them and take them home and read them and learn something from me. That was like, wow, it was amazing. And so when I came to New York, one of the first young people that I met was a young girl called Yolanda. And so she brought me to the public library and told me that you could do that, you know. And I remember walking and looking for names that sounded Spanish, you know. This is like not, you know, there was Cervantes, and then there was William Carlos Williams, and that was pretty much it. I could not find anybody else that sounded remotely Spanish. But I figured, you know, maybe it's just they don't have it here. But the more mature I became, the more libraries I went, the more books I read, the more I realized there's very, very little literature about us here in the United States. And I really understood that when you're not in the culture of a country, whatever country it may be, if you're not in the culture, you don't exist. You just don't for the powers that be. And so this is why I respect, love, support, and encourage not only libraries, librarians, but people who use the library, because if you don't use it, we won't have them. And they are absolutely essential to our well-being and to our lives, really. I was saved by the public library.
Luis, what about you? Library in Vega Alta, library here in New York?
I read, just like you, the newspaper, Reader's Digest, and novelas de vaquero. I don't know if anybody remembers what that is, but my father brought them constantly, and then I discovered that we had a local library. And then I spent all of my time after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, whenever classes were over, that's where I will go to read books. And I remember someone who came to the house that my dad knew to sell us El Tesoro de la Juventud. It was an encyclopedia of 20 books where the knowledge of the world was organized alphabetically. So I actually learned history alphabetically, because in March we will get the A, and then in May we will get the B. So I will be learning about the history of the world by letter, because that's how we got the book. And then when I came to New York, I was very fortunate to go to Aspira, and they needed people to help with research. And they hired me. I was making almost nothing. It didn't matter. And someone told me, you have to go to the New York Public Library. And in my head, I'm like, okay, can someone tell me where is the New York Public Library? But I was on 31st Street. Someone actually said, oh, it's just 9 blocks from here. And I remember going into the library. My library in Vega Alta was probably not bigger than part of this room. To be welcomed by the lions, and then walk in this spectacular place that had so many books.
Beautiful, thank you. A few more questions. One is about the matriarchs. I think it's a commonality amongst our 3 memoirs. And our lives are very different, our memoirs are very different, but that is a common thread. The presence of the matriarchs, it's hot. You know, both giving us tremendous love and support, and also holding us to task and giving us a hard time. What is something that you received from one of the matriarchs that you still find useful today? I mean, share the wisdom is basically the question.
Oh, wow. Well, my mother didn't teach me how to cook. But I think what I got from my mother is her tenacity. This woman would not give up. She just wouldn't. And so her insistence on what she thought she wanted to do with her life, and she had very, very few resources, as you know, probably all of our parents were. She had very few resources. She did a lot with those resources. I still remember her making sopa de salami. You know, I mean, I had never had that, but I mean, you know, a salami can go a long way for a lot of people. So, but she was very, very creative, very artistic in that way of taking what little she had and making amazing things with it, including being a really good mother under incredible challenging circumstances. So I think I'd like to say that I have some of her tenacity, you know, and I wish I cooked better, but I do think that sense that I will not give up. Yo no me rindo. Yo no me rindo, you know. That is something that I feel very strongly, and that it really comes from her and from the fact that she knew that all her energies had to go through fulfilling these ambitions that she had, and she would do whatever she needed to do to fulfill them, and that was amazing. It's a big, big lesson.
Beautiful.
For me, both my mom, my abuela, and the person who raised me, Mundi, were three important figures. My mom will demand excellence. Being number two was not a choice. Wow. There was something you didn't do if you were number two. My grandmother my grandmother loved without conditions. There was nothing that she will look at where she will look for the positive part of it. And Mundi, who actually Lin-Manuel immortalizes in The Heights as Abuela Claudia, her name was Edmunda Claudia, lived with us her entire adult life. She raised me, and then when Lin-Manuel was born, we brought her from Puerto Rico to live with us. And for Mundi, she was our defender. Even when Lin-Manuel or I will talk about we were not right in what we did, she will say, uno nunca dice eso. Uno nunca dice que uno no estaba right. So it was this defender that existed in our lives.
Wow, thank you. Okay, one more question, and then I'm going to turn to some of the community questions I received. In the memoirs, none of us are saints. You can't write a memoir in which you're a saint. Yours is different because you're a child, but you're a rebel. You're precocious. You're not just listening to mommy and, you know, where are you in the lineup? You're one of the youngest, right?
I'm the eldest of 11.
You're the eldest of 11. Oh my gosh, and I'm the eldest too, and we have such different personalities. But you were very strong, and you had a vision of your own life that didn't always jive with what was happening in the family. And I think it's Jaquira Diaz who says in the introduction, but I might be wrong. She says your memoir is full of cariño and grit. And the stumbles in the books, I think, make them relatable and real. So I'm just wondering if you can think of a detail from your book that comes to mind of a time you learned the hard way. And it doesn't just have to be from when I was Puerto Rican. It could be from any of the three of them. I think so much of, if anyone has read The Turkish Lover, it's funny because a lot of that is set in a very hot apartment, so hot that they're unclothed. And so, you know, we're like method acting here today. But, you know, The Turkish Lover, we can feel you getting lost. You almost lose yourself in The Turkish Lover. So that's one example that comes to mind. But what is something that comes to mind of a time you learned the hard way that's in the books that you could share with us?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind isn't when I was Puerto Rican. My grandmother, my mother's mother, my mother was one of two children. And so her mother had gone to, from Puerto Rico to Brooklyn when I probably before I was born. So I never met her until the day I arrived here at 13 years of age. And I was so excited to meet her because I was her first grandchild. And she was like she was a stranger, and she used to send us un chequecito, and she used to send, you know, little presents and stuff. So she was like this mythic character to me. And within 2 days, I learned that I couldn't trust her because she was an alcoholic. And so, and I mean, she was in the thrall of this situation at a time when I really needed somebody. Mommy couldn't help me. She had 6 other kids to deal with, and I had been looking forward to having somebody. And that's when I realized, okay, estoy sola, you know. And so that is something that has stayed with me for a very long time. My siblings don't like me to talk about the fact that she was an alcoholic, but I said, but for me, it really changed everything for me, because I had completely different expectations from this person who was an elder, who who used to write me nice little letters and all that stuff. And all of a sudden I realized that she couldn't take care of me at a time when I needed to be taken care of. And so that, I think for me, that was a very, very big moment. It was bigger than meeting the Turkish lover, that leaving the Turkish lover, than any of those other experiences, because this one at 13 years old set me on a completely different path than I had been expecting when we arrived here.
Well, I want to piggyback on that and ask, because you mentioned your siblings, you know, no hablamos de esto, like, you know, that there's some stuff that's off limits, and yet memoir writers mess with that formula. Yeah. I felt the book was a sword of truth. It cut me. Reading about the parasite in the panties. We definitely don't talk about that. What? How was it with mommy and with your siblings with this book being released?
I was kind of, they did not read the book until it was a hardcover in my hands. And then I sent it to each one individually, including my parents, who couldn't read English. And because I really had felt, when I decided to write this memoir, I decided I'm going to be honest, I'm going to be truthful, because I didn't think anyone was going to read it. So, and also I just felt like, what was the point of doing something so hard that I had never done, that I had to like teach myself how to do it? Why would I not tell the truth, right? So I made that decision at a very early age. And then once you make that decision, you can't go back. You can't pretend. I couldn't change the names of these people. I couldn't do any of that stuff. So that was a shock for them, because they knew I was writing a book, but they didn't know what it was about until it was in front of them. And so it was really, I was a little worried, but at that point, it didn't matter. You know, their opinion didn't matter. The book is written, it's been published, it's between hardcovers, it's out there. So I was just kind of waiting. And so this is the most important 2 comments that I got from my parents and my siblings. My father says, "I love being the villain in this book." he understood how angry I was with him, and that I really set him up against my mother, who was the one adult in my life that I could, trust in a way that I couldn't anybody else. And then my mother's reaction was, I don't know, esta gente. Everybody thinks that this book is about you, but it really is about me. So she understood that she was my muse and she was my hero. And so she was very, I think because both of my parents didn't put up a fuss or do anything that would get the family lining up in a different way, I think all my siblings have been incredibly generous and kind and complimentary when I'm around. I don't know what happens when I'm not there, but I know that they talk about it and they discuss it, and they might challenge some of my scenes, but they don't tell me. They tell each other, and that's fine.
For me, the issue, it's talking in writing about something that is not a secret in our lives, that my wife had my daughter out of wedlock, that I adopted her when she was 4, and that we were this family that had someone who was born from both of us, someone who came into the marriage. And Lin-Manuel actually gave me the best piece of advice, which was, you could talk about all of us from your vantage point. Don't tell my story. My story, it's my story. Your daughter's story, it's her story. So you could talk about how you perceive the story and how it impacted you, but don't make it about us. It's you interpreting our reality.
That's great advice. Okay, we have a book signing that's gonna culminate at the end of this, so I want to make sure that we get through the next few things. Some audience questions. Okay, Esmeralda. Just sifting through these. There was a question about. Oh, you know what? Okay. Any plans for another memoir?
No. I actually wrote a memoir, another memoir, several years ago, because I wanted to write from the perspective of the adult child looking at my parents' lives. And I wrote it, and it wasn't successful for me, and it wasn't successful for my editor, because she wanted the memoirs to be about me, not about other people. So what I've decided to do is to take a lot. I recorded I think I told you this, that when my parents, in their later years, I started recording them, their history and their stories, and things that I wondered about that I never asked. But now que soy bien presentada, and I'm an older person, and I wasn't afraid to ask anything. So I recorded a lot of their history. And then my dad was so thrilled with this process that he actually got to tell his side of his story. And I gave him this little recorder that he then would record things, because otherwise I would be on the phone with him for like days. So he would record things. And then he started recording his brothers, his sisters, and then his neighbors. He started doing it, and then he would just send them to me. And he'd say, este cassette es de Don Caño, somebody I've never met. So he was recording just his friends, because he knew I was curious about what it was like to be Puerto Riqueño in the early 20th century. So then what I've decided is to take a lot of the stories that my dad and my mom told me about their lives, and a lot of the stories that my dad recorded from his friends. And so I'm writing a novel that actually covers both, because the stories were so fascinating to me. And it actually allowed me the freedom to say a lot of things that my parents didn't say and that I think should have been said. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Wow, that's the fact that your father, you taught your father something.
Yes.
And it changed him. And I just personally, it resonates with me in my own writing, because before I was writing memoir, my plays are based out of community stories and mostly out of family stories. And with most of them, there has been a process of interviewing also. So I wrote a play called Elliot, A Soldier's Fugue, that was about 3 generations of Puerto Rican men and women serving in the United States military and their experience in Korea, in Vietnam, and in Iraq. I interviewed my uncle who had served in Vietnam. He was cleanup crew as part of the Marines. And I interviewed my cousin who had just come back from Iraq with a leg injury. He was one of the first Marines to cross the border north into Iraq from Kuwait during that conflict. And the experience was wild because my cousin was so in it. For him, he was narrating his injury, which he's had like almost 30 surgeries now. Almost like he was watching an exciting boxing match, like he was so in it. Whereas my uncle had had 30 years of reflection, of nightmares, of the way trauma kind of unfolds over time. And I called my uncle a few days later to thank him for he was so honest with me. I asked him one question: what year did you enlist? And he spoke. This man, he never spoke. He just laughed at the Eagles game, okay? But he spoke for 3 hours almost. He told me about close range, killing. What cleanup crew as a Marine in Vietnam meant. And when I called to thank him, he told me about friends he had lost. He cried. I had never seen my uncle cry. And so when I called to thank him, he said, "I want to thank you, Kiki." And I said, "Why would you thank me?" And he said, "I haven't felt this light in 30 years. And that was when I knew whether the play is good or bad, whether it gets good or bad reviews, whether it gets a big production or never produced, the process of asking, tell me your story, had value just amongst ourselves. And so I was kind of hooked.
Let me just to say that I really encourage all of you, if your parents are still around, our parents, we don't ask them things that our friends ask of us. We have, ese cohibido, that we just don't. I think one of the things that I learned is the same experience you had with your uncle. They want to talk about it, but they won't volunteer it because for them it's really, really hard. And also they think nobody cares. My parents did not think that anybody cared about their experiences. And so when you have somebody who cares, it is a huge weight off of their shoulders because now they're not carrying that history all by themselves.
I think creating a space, it's almost a sacred act to create a space where you say, I'm listening. That's it. And in the case of what I found with veterans was there really aren't appropriate spaces in civilian life, to be honest, about active combat experiences. And so creating that small gesture, that small space made a big difference. Luis, there were questions about Promesa. What is your assessment of Promesa now and its results? And how do you reflect on your relationship with it as it was forming and passing?
I talked about Promesa in the book. So there's many pages dedicated to that. First, let's put in context that I have spent my life doing. And sometimes you do things that you regret. Sometimes you do things that you applaud and you're happy that you did. Alejandro Garcia Padilla, who was the governor of Puerto Rico at the time, and President Obama, who is the president at the time, had a Republican Congress, and the only thing they could negotiate with the Republican Congress was a piece of legislation that had a control board. Because the problem was that, different from any city or state in the United States, Puerto Rico couldn't declare bankruptcy. And because they couldn't declare bankruptcy, if the hedge funds wanted to collect the money, they will go directly into the accounts of the government of Puerto Rico and take the money away. So there won't be money to pay workers. There won't be money for services. The only way to stop that was to create a law that allowed Puerto Rico to declare bankruptcy. Everybody was in favor of that. The difficulty was that the Republicans said, as they have said historically and are saying now, esta gente son un montón de pillo. These people, you cannot trust Puerto Ricans. So we are going to appoint a control board. And that's how the control board is created. And Obama then negotiates a 7-person board, 3 appointed by him and 4 appointed by Congress. When Democrats took over Congress, the dynamics changed, or promesa, because they were able to appoint then people who were Democrats. So that's why we supported promesa, because we saw it as the only way for Puerto Rico to get out of the funk in which it was.
Now, very quickly, because I do want to move on to this closing ceremony before the signing, and I know we're all melting like church candles up here. But now, reflecting now, just to push you a little bit farther on that, reflecting now how it has evolved, where do you feel that it's at, and how do you reflect on that now?
I lived through the control board in the city of New York. The city of New York had a control board to get it out of bankruptcy. And there were many things that were bad and some things that allowed for economic help to come. I think the issue in Puerto Rico, it's that the way it has worked, it's by being a pseudo government that overturns the things that the people elected for Puerto Rico want. And that is absolutely crazy, because then you ended having 7 people appointed by Congress that were not elected by the people of Puerto Rico, and the elected people of Puerto Rico have to ask permission for economic decisions, and that is absolutely bonkers.
Thank you. Okay, so here we go. I want to return to my initial question. Who here, keep your hand up and then lower it as the questions proceed. Who here has read When I Was Puerto Rican? Okay. Who here, now keep those hands up, you can lower it. Who amongst you remembers the part about guavas? Okay, my favorite, come up here, please. Okay, hands up still if they were up. Anyone who amongst you does not feel comfortable saying words into a microphone? Okay, if your hand is still up, please come up here. Writers usually read their work to us, but I was wondering if, and maybe someone who doesn't know it but would like to participate in this, I was wondering if we could actually reflect Esmeralda's words back to her. Thank you, please come up. So she can hear her words in our voice, please. This is the introduction of the book. So you've heard close to the ending. I didn't spoil the ending, you did. So if we can just go paragraph by paragraph and read aloud. Barco que no anda, no llega a puerto. A ship that doesn't sail never reaches port. I'm sorry I'm giving you my back. There are guavas at the shop and save. I pick one the size of a tennis ball and finger the prickly stem end. It feels familiarly bumpy and firm. The guava is not quite ripe. The skin is still a dark green. I smell it and imagine a pale pink center, the seeds tightly embedded in the flesh.
A ripe guava is yellow, although some varieties have a pink tinge. The skin is thick, firm, and sweet. Its heart is bright pink and almost solid with seeds. The most delicious part of the guava surrounds the tiny seeds. If you don't know how to eat a guava, the seeds end up in the crevices between your teeth.
When you bite into a ripe guava, your teeth must grip the bumpy surface and sink into the thick edible skin without hitting the center. It takes experience to do this, and it's quite tricky to determine how far beyond the skin the seeds begin.
Oh my God, I actually need glasses. Some years when the rains have been plentiful and the nights cool, you might bite into a guava and not find many seeds. The guava bushes grow close to the ground, their branches laden with green, then yellow fruit that seem to ripen overnight. These guavas are big and juicy, almost seedless, their roundness enticing you to have one more, just one more, because next year the rain may not come.
As children, we didn't always wait for the fruit to ripen. We raided the bushes as soon as the guavas were large enough to bend the branch.
A green guava is sour and hard. You bite into it at its widest point because it's easier to grasp with your teeth. You'll hear the skin, meat and seeds crunching inside your head, while the inside of your mouth explodes in little spurts of sour.
You grimace.
You grimace, your eyes water, and your cheeks disappear as your lips purse into a tight O. But you have another, and then another, enjoying the crunchy sounds, the acid taste, the gritty texture of the unripe center. At night, your mother makes you drink castor oil, which she says tastes better than a green guava. That's when you know for sure that you're a child and she has stopped being one.
I had my last guava the day we left Puerto Rico. It was large and juicy, almost red in the center, and so fragrant that I didn't want to eat it because I would lose the smell. All the way to the airport, I scratched at it with my teeth, making little dents in the skin, chewing small pieces with my front teeth, or front teeth, or that I could feel the texture against my tongue, the tiny pink pellets of sweet.
Today I stand before a stack of dark green guavas, each perfectly round and hard, each $1.59. The one in my hand is tempting. It smells faintly of late summer afternoons and hopscotch under the mango tree. But this is autumn in New York, and I'm no longer a child.
We have one final paragraph.
Oh, okay. See, I'm all teary, but the guava joins its sisters under the harsh fluorescent lights of the exotic fruit display. I push my cart away toward the apples and pears of my adulthood, their nearly seedless ripeness predictable and bittersweet.
Feliz cumpleaños. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for doing that with us. And I believe that Esmeralda and Luis are going to be signing books, so please purchase a copy and have them sign yours. Or maybe like me, you brought your old raggedy copies.